Let's go live to Washington. Annalise Nielsen joins us. Annalise is joined by the former US ambassador to Australia, Jeff Bleich.
Kieran, thank you. And thank you for joining us, Jeff.
Now, Annalise, I'm glad to be here.
This is a big night for America, but it's a big night for our relationship with America as well, for Australia. In particular, one of the things I found interesting that we haven't been talking about much is what's going to happen to the US economy. In particular, if Trump gets in, he wants to put tariffs in. We're not immune to that. And he wants to tank the US dollar to compensate for that. That's going to have huge ramifications for the Australian dollar.
Yeah, no, the economists who've evaluated his plan say that he could put the United States back into a recession and an inflationary spiral. Tariffs, as you know, they just make the cost of living harder on people within our country. It'll raise prices all around the world, and it will, again, it creates a strong inflationary pressure. Likewise, devaluing the U.S. dollar, there's a reason why people are proud of sound as a dollar, where we have been the international currency, and I think for good reason. And so that again is something that Kamala Harris has criticized, and that I think our partners around the world are justifiably concerned about.
Look, I mean, coming into this potentially new administration, what's your advice for Australia? How do we advocate for ourselves, given, I mean, these traditional alliances don't mean that we're not going to have to see some renegotiating on some key fronts? I'm thinking tariffs, but people are also concerned about AUKUS. Yeah,
well, there will be two options for a new administration, and so you have to think through both of those. I think if Kamala Harris is elected, that the relationship between the United States and Australia will be very similar in terms of our international alliance, and our bilateral partnership, but also all of our broader alliances and relationships around the world. So there won't be a lot of adjustment. I think AUKUS will be very much secure and I think bolstered by Vice President Harris, who I know well and who was very strong advocate of our Australia relationship, and she and I have discussed it a number of times. If former President Trump's elected, it's a very different mixed bag. I mean, he's not someone who is recognized the difference between allies and partners and adversaries. If there's a deal to be made that he thinks is either in America's interest or in many cases in his own interest, he will try and make that deal. And that is a very, very different approach to foreign policy. And it's the reason why so many of his foreign policy advisors have been highly critical of him and have actually come out publicly to say he's unfit to return to the Oval Office.
So, I mean, over the last few years, the people really managing the day-to-day relationship with Australia in the White House have been Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell. Do you think they'll stay around? I know there's been some reporting that Jake Sullivan and Kamala Harris don't really get along. Do you think she's going to set up a new shop? And do you know who might be in the mix?
No, Jake Sullivan and the Vice President get along very well, and as does Kurt Campbell. I think they're right now the country is feeling unsettled, and I don't think that she wants to make major shifts in personnel that will unsettle it further. I think she will have her own team in place, but in a transition to Vice President Harris, she'll have time to assess people's work and what she needs and find the right fit and make adjustments over time. You'll have a much more disruptive change if former President Trump were to be elected, because what he did last time was he cleared house. My friends who were in embassies were kind of told, you have to be out by January 6th. And they're like, well, I've got kids in school. And they're like, sorry, January 6th, out. So it will be a very abrupt transition. In one case, it will be a gradual transition, which I think is focused on ensuring that there is no major destabilization in American leadership, particularly in a complicated world in the foreign policy area.
Oh, yeah, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people around Washington, D.C. who will be told the same.
Yes.
For January 6th. Kieran?
Yeah, Jeff Bleich, we talk about
Kieran?
the 7 battleground states. Yeah, great to see you. A big day. It's been such an epic campaign, but I want to get your thoughts or analysis on the 7 battleground states. Maybe we throw in Iowa into that as well. Do you see a scenario where, I know it's close, but where they all go one way as opposed to the other, where they all are won by one of the candidates, so the Electoral College doesn't end up as close as many might suspect or fear.
Yeah, I think that's a viable scenario. In fact, in some ways, it may be the most likely scenario, because these elections tend to have a through line in them. And in this case, one of the big questions is going to be a female turnout, and whether women, particularly traditionally Republican voting women, turn out for Kamala Harris. If they do that in numbers, then you're likely to see a movement all in one direction. And if they don't, you're likely to see a movement all in the other direction. I'd say the third most likely scenario would be kind of a split, where you have, for example, the blue wall states going Kamala Harris's way, and the Sun Belt, Rust Belt, states going more in the in Donald Trump's direction, in which case you would eke out a narrow victory. But really, honestly, anyone who tells you what's going to happen tonight is lying. No one knows, even the most sophisticated analysts.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I heard one of your colleagues, someone you know well, David Pluff, just in the last 24 hours, quite optimistic though. It's very interesting. He's a very understated person. He's a senior advisor to Harris. But where would that optimism come from, in your view, in the final days?
I think his optimism is coming from two things. One is Kamala Harris's closing argument was very much disciplined, and she had a positive, optimistic message for America and a clear contrast. I think Donald Trump's message, which was articulated initially as a very clear message, was garbled by the fact that he kept going off script, and every time he talked about, Arnold Palmer, or about Liz Cheney facing 9 gun barrels trained on her face, or attacking journalists, because I happen to love journalists. Whenever those things happened, it took them off message and kind of made the case for Kamala Harris. So that's one thing that's given him some confidence, because we're seeing that in the polls, and we're seeing that in canvassing. The other is where the undecided voters are going, and right now there is a break, probably a 10-point or higher break in favor of Kamala Harris. The question is, will that be enough to compensate for other places where she's losing votes? But I think David Pluff is good at this, and those would be the sources of his optimism.
Yeah, well, great to chat to you. Thanks for making the time to chat to Annalise.